Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Centre for London's first public webinar. We're very pleased that you could all join us this afternoon. I'm Ben Rogers, the founding director of Centre for London, the capital's dedicated think tank and a charity. For those of you who don't know much about us, we develop new solutions to London's critical challenges, and we advocate for a fair and prosperous global capital, and we do that through publishing research, staging events, convening and influencing. We all know that coronavirus has had a sort of huge impact on all of us and will have knock-on effects for years, if not decades. It's laying bare hidden problems, highlighting stark inequalities and revealing the fragility and the interdependence of our infrastructure and the systems that run the city. But it's also unlocking new ways of working, new partnerships, and new forms of social organisation, all of which we need to harness to help London during the recovery. We at Centre for London are committed to helping London both manage the crisis and deliver a successful recovery. And as part of that programme of research and events, we're aiming to bring you in closer contact with Londoners who are leading the capital's response to the virus. And that's what we're doing here today. Each talk will assess the impact that lockdown is having on London, share stories of resilience and adaptability, and highlight some of the partnerships and initiatives that will support London's recovery. During this series, we'll be covering a range of issues, including homelessness, hunger, transport to gender. In this first webinar, we're setting the scene by exploring how the city's residents are coping with lockdown. It's a big topic, but we have two speakers who are more than up to the task. So I'll introduce Ben Page, Chief Executive of Ipsos Mori and Trustee of Centre for London. I'm sure many of you would have seen Ben on TV, particularly on election night, but he's the country's leading pollster. And of course Clare Coghill, leader of Waltham Forest and executive member for Business Europe and Good Growth at London Councils. In terms of format, the way this is going to work is that Ben and Claire will share their thoughts with us. Then we'll take questions from the audience. You can ask questions via the Q&A function on Zoom and also via Twitter if you're watching us on YouTube. And Twitter, the tweet is hashtag LDN responds, so LDN responds. As I say, we encourage you to ask questions and I'll post those to the panelists. Before we go any further, we've got a poll for you. We've got in fact two polls. So there's a chance now for those of you who are on Zoom to answer a poll. And the first poll is about to what extent you think Londoners are following the government's advice on lockdown. So let me now go over to our speakers. First of all, Ben Page and then Claire. But just before we ask you to say a few words. I mean, just thinking about both of you about your last month, what has been perhaps the worst thing and the best thing for you personally over the last month? Starting perhaps with Ben.
We employ about 2,000 people, so I've had to furlough 800 people over the last. That's been fairly tough. It's just, I think it's it's spending lots of time on calls like this actually, because you've gone from having lots of meetings, which you do as a CEO, to suddenly just being in your house. But actually, there's been quite a bit of coverage of this recently. The mental demands of doing calls and having meetings using tools like Zoom is much greater, interestingly, than face-to-face meetings. So I find after doing this for 12 hours a day, I'm sort of exhausted. But on the good thing is just eating nice food, and sitting in the garden. I'm very lucky to have a garden, sitting in this nice weather. So it's been a nice, simple existence, books and TV. And if you treat one day as it comes, it's fine. But I mean, I'm still I've taken a 20% pay cut, but I'm still a very lucky person compared to lots of people, which we'll come to.
Excellent. And you, Claire, what's been best and what's been hardest?
Best has been the response of the staff at Waltham Forest and the community, which has just been absolutely wonderful. The hardest is I'm hugely gregarious. Not being able to get out is really, really tough personally. And just worrying about people. The way we started to sign off our emails, stay safe and take care. And there's lots of care that we're showing one another, which is so positive. But it's because I think we're genuinely worried about colleagues and family and friends in a way and to a degree that we haven't had to do that before. So yeah.
Brilliant. Right, Ben, I think you've got some slides to show us.
Okay, so a quick bit of death by PowerPoint. There we are. Up. Okay, so I've just had a look at, we're doing a whole load of international and national tracking, looking at public attitudes to virtually every aspect of life, and obviously that includes London. We haven't done London specific work, but in terms of what we can see, I went back and had a look through the data. So the first thing is that Londoners are actually a little bit less worried about COVID-19 than the rest of the country, or at least less likely to cite it as one of the biggest problems facing Britain. Some of that may be simply because London tends to be somewhat less, is younger than the rest of Britain. So you can see in Britain as a whole, we've got 69% of 18 to 24-year-olds who are worried about it. It's 90% of those who are over 65. And so London as a slightly younger city, has slightly fewer pensioners than the country as a whole, is a bit less worried about it. It is worried about the economy. And, you know, one of the challenges, and we'll come to this in a second, is that, you know, London is disproportionately represents some of the parts of the economy that have been very heavily hit. And, you know, so that's certainly a challenge in London. And interestingly, on the NHS, 36% of Londoners say that they're very worried about the NHS. That's markedly higher than the surrounding areas. So whether that's because we are, of course, at the centre of we were the early part of the contagion in Britain, we still have more deaths than other regions. We've seen, of course, endless news coverage, both of NHS workers dying and also, of course, building the NHS Nightingale Hospital and the Cllr Centre. So again, that's sort of occupied people's minds. Although it's fair to say that overall in London, as everywhere else, we may be worried about it or say it's one of the biggest challenges, but we're also saying that we're confident the NHS will cope. So in terms of how Londoners feel, I had a look through the data. There's general support for lockdown, which is pretty similar to in London as everywhere else. About 90% of us say we support it. We are a bit less supportive of the government and more likely to say it was late. But of course, when you look at London, and some of this is heavily related to voting intention. So Labour voters are about twice as likely as Conservative voters to say that the government was late. And of course, London is a much more Labour voting place than some other parts of Britain. So in a way, you might not think that's very surprising. The big challenge in London, as elsewhere, is about the economy and job losses more than the chance of actually catching the virus yourself. So in terms of the things that people say they're changing, finding hard, just staying positive, and that's, staying positive about the future, getting in touch with family and friends, keeping entertained, staying fit and healthy. These are the things that most of us, and Londoners on all of these things are about as likely to say that these are problems. Interestingly, despite the fact that we have lots of people in small flats, it doesn't seem that London is actually suffering more than other parts of the country with the virus. It's more on the economic factors. So on things like being able to afford your usual expenses, Londoners are a bit more likely, because we've got lots of young people working in some of the industries that have been most affected, and a bit more likely to mention it. But to start with, it was all about getting what you need from the shops. And then we've got 6 out of 10 people sort of saying, yeah, being able to work is a problem. And one of the most striking things on this so far is, I think on one estimate, 1/4 of people employed in the private sector are now on the government's coronavirus job retention scheme. I mean, that is a phenomenal situation. So in terms of what we're saying about what's going on, we're a bit more concerned about Britain as a whole than ourselves. We've got some signs that Londoners are a bit, partly perhaps because they're younger, we're a bit more likely to be breaking lockdown. There's about 9% of us who say we go out when we shouldn't and we do things we shouldn't. The figure for Britain as a whole is about 4%, but it's not a massive number. And we're sort of average we're more likely to say we're working from home. And in a sense, we've got lots and lots of service industry and knowledge workers in London. And if you are a knowledge worker in London, of course, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies work will show, you're going to be much more likely to get through this without having to, to be able to just transfer from your office to work at home, and you'll be okay. Although there's a sting in the tail on that I want to come to. So we're a bit more likely to shop online. All of the things, basically, ordering takeaways, they're all things that we would expect with the age profile of London, quite frankly. So there's nothing particularly dramatic. As I say, Londoners are confident about the NHS's ability to cope. And I think one of the interesting things for me about what's happened in Britain is that it seems that we're just very stoic. And of course, there's been this massive drop-off in normal usage of the NHS, probably storing up problems for the future. but people just aren't turning up there. And that's both, it's sort of interesting compared to Italy, where we have roughly the same sort of trajectory, roughly the same population. Their hospitals are absolutely packed. Ours, we seem to be just stoically saying, oh, I mustn't grumble and die at home. Anyway, we will deal with that. But we are a bit more likely to say it's hard to pay our bills, again, which is reflecting the profile of London. So my shtick on all of this is that we are probably, and again, I will come to the accuracy of anybody's predictions. My predictions on Tuesday about elections on Thursday are generally now very good. But this is, when you get a few months away or something like this, very, very different. So it looks like a U-shaped recession. And because if you look at, I looked at our business, for example, in 2008-9, it took us 5 years to get back to where we were before. Now, that was a different sort of event, but it does look as though, you know, we're going to see knock-on effects. So we've got this short-term massive hit to travel, to tourism, hospitality, retail. You've just shown us the air travel figures, Ben. And I think that the thing that we must be wary of is that the aftershocks are not necessarily even visible yet. And one of the things that we've seen from our business in China, and the polling here still suggests that it might be the same, is that even when shops reopen, and indeed Berlin is noticing this at the weekend, even when the shops reopen or the small shops reopen, people are worried about their jobs. We've got 66% of Londoners saying they're worried about their job security. And that means that they don't spend for financial reasons, and they don't spend because we've absolutely bought the message that this is a clear and present danger and you're safer at home. So there's a real, even as lockdown starts to happen, there is not necessarily an immediate upsurge in spending. There seems to be evidence, again, it will come out in due course, that it's going to differentially affect poor people, Black and minority ethnic, and obviously casual and manual workers. Either they're more likely to lose their jobs or more likely to get infected. I think longer term, and again, I know that you're working on this, Ben, and thinking about the scenarios, but certainly as an employer of people in busy and expensive central offices, you know, many young couples, you maybe starting to think,
Right. I think we've lost Ben Page for a moment. Is that right? Claire, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Have you lost us, Ben, as well?
I have lost Ben, unfortunately.
Okay, fine. Okay. I'll go to you, and we'll bring Ben back when we can. Technology does sometimes let us down. Right, Claire. I mean, just to talk about how it's been for Waltham Forest over the last month or 6 weeks, and how have you responded, and really what are the sort of impacts of the virus been on your residents and your services?
Thank you very much, Ben. I'm so happy that you've held this and hosted it, because it's incredibly important that we start to wrap our heads around this. I think my local authority and lots of local authorities around the country, we had to, once we knew the enormity of what we were dealing with, we had to sort of withdraw into ourselves, obviously working in partnership with our neighbours across London, but also we needed to be very aware of the immediate risks and the immediate things that we needed to put in place. So making sure that we could reach all of those vulnerable adults, that we could provide face-to-face support for people fleeing DV and continue to do that work. So there was lots and lots of practical stuff that we needed to do. In my own authority, we decided that we weren't going to change our services week in, week out, as we stepped gradually towards a point where we would be reduced to providing critical only services, but that we would lift our heads to the horizon and say, where are we going to be? So just as we were starting week 1, to say to ourselves, where will we be in week 8? So not saying in week 1, let's look at week 2, saying, okay, so where are we going to be in the much longer term? And that has stood us in very good stead. When I talk about critical services, what I mean is that very swiftly we moved to a position where we were making sure that we got the right support in place for adult social workers and their client group, children's social workers and theirs, and that we had a school community that was ready to continue to provide support for the children of key workers and for children that we deemed to be vulnerable if they were going to be staying in their own homes all day. And that required such an enormous amount of work and an incredible human effort to get that done. And at the start of this process, we had about 200 people who were tooled up and ready to work from home and who were working from home, say 1 day a week. We've now got 1,800 members of our staff working at home. So there's been this huge shift, this huge acceleration. For example, we've got a great relationship with our local hospital, Whips Cross, and we were working on some brilliant and innovative stuff, as lots of trusts and local authorities are, around discharging patients, particularly those who were at risk of staying in hospital far longer than they needed to. And we thought we were doing really well when we got down to sort of 30 people a week, or rather up to 30 people a week. We're now doing over 30 people a day. So it's this tremendous effort that has produced this extraordinary network of support for people, our residents, our staff. But now the challenge is going to be, how will we sustain this in the potentially much, much longer term? Because people are going to need to take rest. They're going to need to take holidays. Holidays might not mean this summer and this autumn and this winter what they normally mean. They might not mean, you know, a week out of the country or a week visiting relatives who live in a foreign country. That might mean staying at home. And how we help people adjust to that situation is hugely important. I think I've been staggered at the range of sort of innovation that we've seen from people. A couple of things that I definitely wanted to mention. One is we've got over 200 people now who are doing jobs completely different from the ones that they normally do, and they jumped at that opportunity. So I think the desire for people actually to live far different lifestyles, i.e. working from home far more. You know, I was talking to Matt, who works for me in my office the other day, at the end of the day, and I could hear his little daughter chatting away on his knee. That's a completely different way of working that's far more satisfying to me because he's happy, far more satisfying to him because he's happy, and far more satisfying to his little daughter because she gets time with her dad. And I think we need to find the space to have those conversations as well about quality of life that people are seeing that they haven't seen before. So I think air quality, I'm so glad to see that raised today. You know, if we lose the gains that we've demonstrated now that people have enjoyed so much by just going back to business as usual when it comes to road travel, that will be a tragedy on a huge scale, and it will be such a missed opportunity. And I really hope that people can see and have seen, and I know that they have, that they can go to their local shop and they can get everything they need from there. They can that they can shop from neighbours, that they can get to know the local businesses. There's been a lot of that going on in my patch, and that's just been wonderful. I think one of the other things that I just wanted to touch on in that vein was around homelessness. You know, the effort that the GLA put into, alongside pretty much every local authority senior officer who works in housing in our capital, to getting people into beds. We housed 41 rough sleepers and the cat of one of them as well. Esther the cat is well, as are all of the people who we've been working with. And how we make this, you know, out of the ashes of this horrible situation, how do we find the positives? How do we find the life transforming opportunities for people? Because they are there. And, you know, I think that's a good way to honour all the public sector workers who've worked so hard to think creatively about how we can change their lives and our lives for the better.
Brilliant. I've got some questions, but Ben, we lost you for a moment there.
No, I saw, sorry, I don't know. I've switched to a mobile phone because my computer seemed to reboot itself.
Oh, okay. So do you want to just, I mean, so let's not, no more screen, but maybe just summarize what you were saying if you want to.
Well, I think it's simply that obviously many parts of the London economy are heavily hit. The interesting thing for me was that we already saw a fall in TfL rider use, you know, numbers before this hit, partly because more people were working from home, not commuting into London as much. There was a very clear trend in that direction. As we've already heard from Clare, you know, there's been a massive acceleration in use of this technology. And there is a scenario where firms like mine, who are paying millions of pounds in rent, decide that actually, I've already closed actually 2 offices since it started because the leases in different parts of the country were coming up for renewal. Everybody was at home. They're all working from home productively. We didn't really need the office in the same way. So I can see it's a massive adjustment if that actually happens. I mean, it's hard to predict, and it will be combined with the post-Brexit effects, which we haven't even come to the dreaded Brexit word, and the aftershocks of this massive. But the unknown factors for London are: do we have a government? Do we now have a government that just does grand? Does it come out of the? Do we come out of this deciding to have a big reset and look at things like the environment and a Green New Deal? Let's not go back to emitting carbon in the way that we were before. Or is it like 2008, where it's absolutely crazy, hell bent for leather to get people back into work and to start, driving, get back people flying, build more roads, build everything. We're far too close to it to know which of those it will be. I think the idea of an activist state, though, is certainly here to stay.
No, I agree. That's really interesting. Ben, one thing is that I think a lot of us have been slightly surprised by the sense of sort of solidarity that people are displaying through all of this. And perhaps this is a question.
I think we're too pessimistic. You see, I think remember, in the polling that we do every year for London councils, we found that people, time after time, in fact, for the last 20 years, one of the best things about London, people say, is actually then the neighbours, the mix of people here. And we've got about 9 out of 10 Londoners who say that people from different backgrounds get on really well in their neighbourhoods.
Yeah.
And sometimes we forget that sometimes. And I think that's what you're seeing, actually. I shop for my neighbour. I never used to speak to him much. Now I do his shopping.
And is that sort of showing up? Those changes showing up in the polls yet? That trust and.
Well, I think it's not so much. People are saying that they're reaching out to I've just used a terrible American expression, they're talking to their family and friends more, and that they value those relationships more. And we're seeing that both in Britain and across the world. 80% of people say they're seeing that. I do wonder that what I think we need to be careful about, though, is assuming that, these changes will stay the same once we start to return to normality, because I think that's the reason people often don't do these things is not because they're antisocial. It's just that they're far too busy sorting things out. This has imposed a sort of slower way of life on us.
Yeah. And
the question is whether you can sustain some of those things.
Claire, so a couple of questions for you. One, I suppose, is, do you have thoughts about to what extent you have seen a bit of a sort of flourishing of sort of social capital and connectedness and community spirit in Waltham Forest, and how might you then sort of sustain that? So I think you can do once we get into recovery. But then also, who are you most worried about amongst your residents, and who are you most worried about amongst your service providers, amongst your staff?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've seen some fantastic stuff when it comes to social connectedness, and I'm on lots of the WhatsApp groups for my little patch. So and I've talked to colleagues a lot about it. So we've got a really good picture of the sort of work that's going on, and the areas that the things I've found really interesting are that there's some great sort of helping neighbours out with shopping stuff, which is fantastic. I love all of that. But actually, when it comes to the difficult stuff, so I'm on a WhatsApp group where there was a lady who hadn't said anything previously, and then announced on a Sunday night that actually her laptop broken, and that's causing everything that's going on in her life to sort of cascade out, and she announces it on this WhatsApp group. And of course, it's greeted with sort of quite daunted silence from people who aren't actually equipped to support her in the way that she needs to do so. So I think it's how we now start to knit that activist voice and that activist perspective back into those core council services. I love the fact that people are talking about all public sector workers in the way that they are, which is absolutely fantastic. I think social workers have always been undervalued and unsung heroes within our systems. And it's their capacity to provide the therapeutic work, the highly skilled work to support those people who are vulnerable all of the time, but especially vulnerable during COVID, that is massively important and is going to really get us through this. And in terms of what I'm worried about, I think I'm most worried about those people, because making sure that they've got the capacity, the emotional strength, the physical well-being to keep going for as long as we need them to keep going back to work every single day, and to keep reassuring those elderly, scared people that they work with all the time that they are going to keep getting the service that they need. That's a really big challenge that I'm very focused on.
Great. And Ben, any big differences between the way that we are responding to this and our neighbouring countries, and in the EU?
We're among the most sort of stoical and realistic in some ways. So we're less likely, pretty much than anywhere, to think that we'll get back to normal by June. And of course, Britons have turned out to be more obedient, than the government ever expected in terms of observing the lockdown. So no, I mean, I think it's in some ways many of the things that you would sort of expect have sort of, in some ways, have happened. The NHS seems to have coped really well. And the British seem to be looking at, 750,000 people have volunteered to help the NHS. I mean, that's phenomenal. So, no, I think sometimes we want to run the narrative that the world is going to hell in a handcart, and obviously it is in some ways. But in terms of community well-being, I mean, until all this came along, even happiness was rising in Britain despite 10 years of austerity.
Great. Do we have our polls are in? So we asked, how closely do you think Londoners are following government advice? And mostly, but not almost entirely. And actually, that's probably right, Ben, isn't it? According to your poll. I mean,
I think they're I think our audience are a bit more sceptical. I don't know. We'll have to check their profile, but overall in London, most people say that I think the typical answer for Londoners would be almost entirely, or a bit more towards almost entirely. But
right.
It's not bad, yeah.
Well, but hang on, would they say that they're almost entirely respecting them, or that other people are?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Actually, yes, because of course it's a bit like asking about your driving. My driving's brilliant, but everybody else's is terrible. So it's presumably my COVID lockdown is brilliant, but I've noticed other people don't seem to be doing what they should. Yeah.
Good. Right, we'll have some more polling later on. Okay. But just one more question for you, Claire, which is about the traffic, because Waltham Forest has become, well known amongst London boroughs for taking a sort of very pro-pedestrian, cycle-friendly approach. Your what do they call it? I can't remember what it's called now. Your street.
Mini Holland.
Mini Holland. Thank you very much.
Enjoy Waltham Forest.
And you really led the way on that. I mean, yeah. And then if you follow Twitter, you sort of see tweets about cities all over Europe closing their streets to traffic during this time. Are you thinking about doing more? Is there more that you could do? How would that go down with your residents?
Definitely. We have massive air quality challenges in my borough, as do Newham, our neighbours, who have, I think we might be the second worst, and Newham are the worst. And that's because of these massive roads that run through our boroughs, not because of anything that our residents do or that we've done that's necessarily that bad or that good. We know that the work that we've done has meant that children born and growing up in our borough today will live at least 6 weeks longer, which doesn't sound a lot, but you start to build that up along with other positive health outcomes, and you're extending the lives of some of the poorest people in the country, and that's absolutely the right thing to do. And given the impact of COVID on people with asthma, COPD, pneumonia, lung-related conditions, I just don't think that people will tolerate pollution in the same way that they have done previously. I think people are going to be watching air quality much more keenly than they have in the past, and that the numbers of people who have respiratory and lung conditions is something that local authorities are going to have to pay much closer attention to than we have previously, and air quality is all linked up with that. So I just think going back to business as usual. I just think
have you formulated plans yet for what you might do in the short term over the next few weeks? Because you don't have a big window. I mean, presumably if we're back in June to sort of lockdown begins to be released.
Absolutely, it's so complicated at the moment. So we're thinking as a cabinet and as a leadership team, and bringing all councillors on that journey with us. We're thinking really radically, and that's the language that we're using about how we adapt to the fact that 90% of British people don't want to go back to business as usual, and other places are taking those opportunities. So there's lots and lots of work thinking happening as we speak. But it's very difficult to do that sort of practical road stuff, given that you can't really send people out to work at this stage. But I think that's going to be medium and long-term projects that we'll see coming forward.
And one final question from Ben before. Well, first of all, the next poll is up. So this is about London's ability to recover from the crisis, and it's asking how positive or negative you're feeling about that. So we'll look forward to those results. Ben, I mean, have you started asking people about whether they intend to change the way they live?
Well, a lot of people say they do, but I was looking at sort of British values over the last 30 years. And while, of course, we have massively changed our attitudes on things like homosexuality or drugs, etc., there are other things where there's been absolutely no change at all. So, you know, and so adultery, for example, so we completely changed our attitudes on homosexuality, but adultery is seen as wrong as it was 30 years ago. And so I'm just wary that we all think that we go into this and we live a different life and then, you know, we sort of permanently change. I think the evidence, but there is some evidence that during World War II, that, you know, after 6 years of World War II, we did come out and set up a whole load of new institutions and Britain was changed. But we have only been at this for about, you know, 6 to 8 weeks so far. So, I fear that there are other things, you know, in a sense, when we look at the 2008 crash and the things that came out of that, some of those took up to, you know, the better part of a decade to become visible, really, or manifest themselves in social movements or in populism, actually. And so I think it's just, we're just too close to the trees to see the wood at the moment. We can, you know, there's lots of things we want to happen. And I think you can see certain technologies, you know, we have seen the massive acceleration of online, digital conferencing, etc. Some of those things will probably stay. But in terms of our values and the fact that we, you know, do we all decide that we don't want to go on lots of fancy holidays and have expensive things and not spend quite as much? We're currently saving about a quarter of our spending because we can't. And you know that may lead to changes, but I think we need to. We're too soon to start deciding now.
Somebody reminded me the other day that in the weeks after 9/11, there was lots of speculation that it was the end of the skyscraper. It was the end of air travel. You know, we just reverted to our habits pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the nightmare is that we come out and we do exactly what we did in 2008, which was go back into accelerating on carbon, because I do think we were having a moment on climate change. It was the global thing that everybody agreed on. Greta Thunberg was more searched for than Beyonce last year on the internet. And so it would, you know, just maybe, given the sort of the size of the state investment that we've now had to make and the size of the debts that we're now dealing with, the incredible finances of it all, maybe, just maybe, there is a time for sort of taking stock. But I fear that at some point, unless governments are going to start employing large portions of the population for a long time, there will be a desperate need to sort of restart economic activity of any type at all costs.
Right. Okay, and we've got our first question in. So, and I'm going to put this into two parts, slightly different for Ben and for Clare. So the question is, what do you think the virus will mean for regional development and the levelling up agenda? Will London be more resilient post-crisis than the rest of the UK, widening inequality? So that maybe that's for both of you, but a particular question for Clare also, which is about what it might mean for Waltham Forest in terms of, you know, people working from home. You know, do you think there's a sort of future for Waltham Forest where actually we move away from the sort of very radial, centrifugal model of development we're seeing in London, with almost all the economic growth or disproportionate amount happening in the centre, and could you actually finally get sort of polycentric city? So maybe I'll go to Ben first to ask about the levelling up question and whether it's the end of levelling up or what this will mean for regional relations, and then Clare, perhaps you to think about or tell us about the future of London's out of town centres.
With the proviso that most predictions are normally wrong, I think the fact that, you know, levelling up and all of that stuff just seems a long time ago, and there's now a sort of potentially a chance for a general reset. However, you know, politicians are politicians, and they know they need to hang on to those constituencies. And even after the ravages of COVID-19, London still has loads more good things going for it than some of the places that they're attempting. So I think, well, the TfL, we haven't talked about TfL finances and what on earth is going to happen there, but it may be that the magic money tree, which now turns out not only to exist, but to be fed on steroids, can help London and the rest of Britain, given what we now see in front of us.
Clare?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I do think the magic money tree has been genetically modified and is turning out massively productive. I wish it had been from 2010 onwards. Yeah, I think there was already a desire to balance quality of life with amount of time spent travelling, frankly. That was already happening in the borough, and I think that may well be on steroids as well. So, you know, we've got lots and lots and lots of businesses growing businesses and freelancers already in the borough who were saying, I just want to live differently and don't want to commute into the centre of London. So I can definitely see that change. And I just sort of feeding off something that Ben mentioned, you know, those 750,000 people. And, you know, the fact that the government had it, you know, people might not know this, but this is going to be one of the things that stands out for me when I reflect on all of this at the end of the year. The fact that the government got all those people together and tried to coordinate them, and then at sort of 9 o'clock on a Friday night sent an email to all local government leaders saying, yeah, you can deal with them. You know, this sort of lack of grip, this lack of leadership. And the reality is that since 2010, the National Civil Service has been hollowed out to predominantly handle policy and data. And it's local authorities that have suffered massively from those reductions in resources, that have been pushed back to rely on council tax and business rates. And we are left as the doers with not much money to do much with. So the resources and who gets them is going to be a very keen fight as we go forward.
So it would be nice to think, wouldn't it, that government would think to itself, my God, we've got enough on our hands managing pandemics and climate change and Brexit and the rest, and we'll finally get round to sort of doing the devolution that we always talk about. On the other hand, the experience from the Second World War above all is, you know, that actually there's nothing like an emergency to act as a sort of centralizing force. So I suppose things hang in the balance. I mean, on the upside for London, you know, if you want to really stimulate the economy, putting money into TfL is probably a better bet than putting into HS2. You know, it might be the case that actually some of this rebalancing agenda, which I entirely support, but which is long term, comes to feel a bit less sort of, you know, pay fewer dividends in the short term than actually investing money in London. And particularly the, you know, TfL is going to need, as we've said, a hell of a lot of money. And probably we quite fundamentally need to rethink the sort of TfL business model, because compared to most other capitals of sort of similar size, we rely hugely on fares, the fare box, and much less on tax to run the service, and you know, we're now really exposed as a system for that reason. A question about the impact, the disproportionate impact that the virus is having on Black and ethnic minority Londoners, and it does seem to be the case that they're more likely to end up in hospital and unfortunately more likely to die. In Chicago, I think it's 70% of the deaths have been from African Americans, but only about 30% of Chicagoans are African American. I was wondering, both of you, do you have any views, and perhaps you particularly, Claire, from your sort of first-hand experience and your knowledge of the borough, why that would be and what we can do to address it?
I think this whole situation is going to expose vast, it's going to provide many examples of inequalities, not least as experienced by members of our BAME communities. I think the fact that people have got a grip of understanding that this is a problem sooner rather than later is a huge advantage. We're doing work internally. Mo Butts, the leader of Brent, great friend and a long-standing leader, is going to be doing work on this on behalf of councils in London. And I just think the fact that the government have looked at this and the Labour Party is looking at it is very positive. But I don't feel I've got enough of the grip of the data. Because as far as I'm aware, it's not available, and I've not seen a comprehensive analysis of it to understand what is going on here. But that's something that I'm watching very closely to try and understand that, because it's it's incredibly important to try and understand that and act accordingly.
So, and then I've got a question here, and I think for both of you, that someone's asked about, you know, how you monitor, understand and evaluate the sort of community response that's happening in London. How do we keep tabs on what's happening and the impact it's having on vulnerable people? So you sort of monitoring what's going on. I mean, I suppose you probably haven't got the time to do that.
Well, it's one of the things that you know, as soon as the community started to understand the scale of what we were dealing with, which with a slight lag behind us because we were working to worst case scenarios even before lockdown started. But one of the things that we started to see was this real desire from people to build networks and support one another, and almost immediately, because as I said, I'm on a number of these WhatsApp groups, it became clear that they had no experience of dealing with vulnerable people, perhaps with mental health issues or with complex health needs. They had no process for handling money that those people might give them to go to the shops, and they just didn't have that understanding of safeguarding. So it was about sort of locking in and trying to understand that. But we created our own channels for people to be able to volunteer, and we haven't had a situation where we've been passing details of vulnerable people out to communities to do it sort of on their back, on their own street. There's nothing to stop you doing that if you know your neighbour and your neighbour is happy for you to do it for them. That's a normal part of life and should absolutely be encouraged. But it was that balance that needed to be struck within 48 hours, because people were starting to say to us, well, why can't we know, you know, the 15 most vulnerable people who live on the streets closest to us, and we'll take care of them? It's like, well, because that's not appropriate. And in no way would those people give us permission to hand on their details. I wouldn't be allowed to see their details. It's only trained social workers who would have access to them, and that's only right.
Right. Yeah, Ben, I mean, to what extent are we going to sort of see changes in volunteering and community activities?
I mean, one hopes that some of the things that we've seen, the WhatsApp groups and the neighbourhood groups and all of this, become more permanent, and there's no reason to think they won't. But you need to, again, we need to be a little bit cautious about saying that it's sort of brought people together. So we have a sort of mini blitz spirit at the moment. I think it does help. It doesn't necessarily last. All I'm saying is it doesn't necessarily last forever once people get back into their pressured daily lives and everything else, unless it's some sort of massive reset. I think there's really interesting stuff that could be done, you know, and again, researchers are scrambling to do things like test for COVID-19 and all sorts of other things at the moment. But there's also, in the same way that you've shown from a whole range of open data sources, we could probably start to look at forums and social media analysis to see if we can see some signs of that. You know, and so there's undoubtedly more that can happen. And I think the fact that more people are now comfortable using technology like this does mean that we will, you know, we can probably create some better virtual communities. But people, you know, most people don't get involved in things because they don't want to spend all their time in meetings, if we're brutally honest.
It's been a question I've been sort of posing to you know, policymakers and local government leaders and tech people for ages. Why isn't there a Facebook for neighbourhoods? And now suddenly there is sort of almost like a range of, I mean, it's come very late, but it's happened, and that is potentially quite profound. But Ben, you're one of the big experts on trust. I mean, have we become less trusting over the years, have we? Or
well, no, it's complicated. I mean, so there's, you know, if you look at trust in professions, it's actually been rising, and trust in ordinary people has actually been rising in Britain. So we need to, you know, there's been no, even in America, trust in government hasn't changed in the last 8 years. And again, you wouldn't believe that the general trope is that trust is in terminal decline everywhere. We did a report, as you know, last year called "Trust, Quote the Truth," and the reason for that. So I think it's not necessarily brilliant, but trust overall there are lower levels of trust in government and institutions than there were in the 1960s. There's a question about whether we would all like to live back in the 1960s when we, you know, with that level of deference that we used to have post World War II, but it's not necessarily in crisis. There are some challenges, and we do trust profession. One thing we do that is clear is that we trust experts, and if anything, the evidence, I mean, we can argue about how experts are doing in the COVID-19 crisis generally, and it turns out that even experts don't always agree with each other. But there's been the one thing that has been, of course, in the crisis, which is what we saw after 9/11 and after the Falklands War, is a rise in trust in Boris Johnson, in the Prime Minister, and in Angela Merkel, although she basically walks on water. She's got 79% satisfied. But it's also true of Macron in France and Conte in Italy. And it's a normal human effect. I mean, Trump is so out there, he's managed to only have it in a very mild way compared to European leaders. But so there is a moment where there's trust in authority, but it's again because people are anxious and need to look somewhere. Right. I'm not sure, but it's certainly trust in neighbours. I don't think there's any sign that that's collapsed. And if anything, this helps build it.
Right. Claire, a question about the that's come in about the Borough of Culture experience.
Yeah.
And do you think that's made it easier for you to recruit and organise volunteers during the crisis? And are there any lessons for the future?
100%. 100%. It's been extraordinary. So the Borough of Culture last year has given us two things for this year. One is this extraordinary network of volunteers who were ready to go. We've carried on with the logo and everything else for that because it had such good local recognition and had and is a trust brand as well, which is fantastic. So we had the legends of the forest, many of whom have been able to help and have been willing to help, and we're now up to 4,000 volunteers, which is extraordinary. The other thing that, having been Borough of Culture last year, enabled us to do this year was last year, everyone in the local authority understood that we were London Borough of Culture, and we were all working towards that. It didn't matter whether you were a social worker or someone who works in the refuse team, but everyone understood that was part of our identity, and they'd be participating in things that supported that collective effort. So that sort of culture, Borough of Culture spirit has translated directly into COVID-19, and and so there have been a couple of moments so far where I've just been desperately grateful that we had that experience last year, because the idea of the local authority actually being focused on collectively on one overarching goal, which is to get all of our residents through this as safely as possible, is second nature to people who work at Waltham Forest. So yeah, we were very lucky in that way.
Good. And an interesting question, if home working is to expand, as it seems likely, will we have to rethink the size and design of homes?
Well, yes, and it's one of the amazing things about this technology, of course, I've now seen far more of my colleagues and my junior colleagues' living conditions when there's four of them trying to work around a kitchen table. So undoubtedly, if we see, I mean, there is a scenario where central London house prices don't go up anymore or go into reverse. Londoners sell up. A lot of people in London want to sell up and move out because they can work on Zoom and buy something much larger. And there is a potential scenario of rebalancing, which is both good and bad in different ways. But I can see that for a lot of people, they're killing themselves trying to buy expensive London property, commuting on packed tubes, and suddenly you've given them an alternative. They can live somewhere much more rural, 2 hours away, particularly if they're having kids, and come into London 2 or 3 times a week off peak. What's not to like? It's not going to work for everybody, and it's very nice for middle class knowledge workers to be able to do that. But you can certainly see that for one group of the population, and maybe that then reduces the pressure on housing for everybody else. Who knows?
Yeah.
Claire, will you be thinking about sort of the design of your homes?
The regen team have been great, actually. Half of them are redeployed, but we still have to keep a planning service, and we've had a planning committee and everything. But I think that's something we will definitely need to think about. But we've always had a few years ago, I had some work done, some research done, and we saw that we had this vastly disproportionate compared with other London boroughs number of who were working from home and who were freelancing. So we'd already worked on, sort of co-working space to give people a bit of reprieve from just being in their homes. But yeah, I think home design is definitely something that we're going to have to look at. Yeah,
we're still building a lot of apartments and flats in London with tiny balconies. I mean, they're just basically a bar across a window, aren't they? I mean, that's probably going to have to change.
Well, those properties just won't. I mean, that's the interesting point, that they've already got problems shifting some of that stock, and it may be that the prices are just, people aren't going to want to pay a fortune for 800 grand for a tiny flat somewhere. Yes, it's close to the centre. They don't. And I mean, unless the mix of the centre is really interesting. Will we be able to sustain all of the entertainment and stuff that we've got there if people, particularly in the near term, don't feel comfortable in a really crowded theatre? And won't do until late next year. So I think there's a big reshuffle likely to happen. I'm sure, of course, some of those things will be there, but there may well be quite a lot of. This is why I think we need to be cautious. We're too close to it to see the aftershocks and know the long-term effects of this now.
I mean, I think I've got teenage kids. It's going to be very hard to stop kids wanting to go into the centre of the city. And that's London. That's what London. So much of London's sort of social life and economy is about, actually. But we as you say, we're very close to it still, and we can't be we can't be sure. Well, I suppose an interesting question about the sort of future of the green belt, and will public attitudes shift on that, and will people begin to see the case for low density development? But I'm
not sure that will change. I mean, the great thing about the green belt is that nobody can actually tell you where it is, but once you tell them it exists, they say it must be protected at all costs. So it's one of those, it's a bit like, it's a mythical thing. Most people can't really tell you what or where it is, but they like the idea of it.
right.
So I mean, again, I think here we're back to my favorite. Government should just get on and do stuff, both on climate change and on the green belt, and they'll find in the same way that Ken Livingstone did when he imposed the congestion charge on a London that mostly said it didn't want it, but then re-elected him in 2004 after he'd done it because it broadly worked. We should just get on with those things, and I'm no more polling.
Right. I mean, so Claire, what's the one really radical thing that you'd like to see Sadiq doing coming out of all this?
Ooh, that's such a good question. I think loads more mini Holland. Loads more of it. I think a paradigm shift when it comes to what Londoners will and won't accept in terms of poor air quality. Like, we're just not going to put up with this. We're not going to put up with the risks to our elderly residents or to our younger residents when their lungs are developing. And we're all going to muck in the way that we have through these WhatsApp groups and community groups. And we're all going to do what needs to be done to make that radical change. Yeah. I think people would respond. I think they would. I
mean, there's no doubt. I mean, it seems very likely that we will see a fewer numbers traveling on public transport. So then we sort of, as a city, we face a choice, don't we? Either we go back to the car, which would be disastrous, or actually we really embrace active travel, cycling, walking, and e-bikes, which are, a game changer. We've been very late to the party in London. And other cities have done this much better, but this is surely the time to really get behind cycling and walking and sort of e-technology.
Definitely. Definitely.
Right, okay, we are pretty much at the end of the session, I'm afraid. We've got lots of questions which I haven't been able to pose, so I'm sorry about that. Do we have the results of our second poll? Are they up? Right, here we go. So this was, how do you feel about London's ability to recover from the crisis? Oh, good. Well, positive and fairly positive, way outscoring neutral and fairly negative. So that's something that's a nice note to end on. So I'm gonna wind up now just to say thank you to Ben and Claire for speaking so well. I should say a bit more about the work we're doing. In particular, we're going to start publishing a regular data update. The London Intelligence, which is something we used to do and we're going to do again, just to look at how London is sort of developing and performing these extraordinary times. And we're doing that in partnership with King's College. Do sign up to our newsletter through our website. Do follow us on Twitter at Centre for London. And if you want to work with us on any of the issues that we've discussed today, we're here to help you, and we're here to help London. So without further ado, thanks again to Claire and Ben so much for all their wisdom and their insight, and keep up the great work. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everyone.